When Terrence Keeley was here last week, he and I ended up in a tangled mess discussing how to cut the deficit. Do you raise taxes or don't you? Well, Terry's back. You see him right here. And this time we're going to move the discussion beyond ideology because politics is a business of compromises. And frankly, neither of us is here to take sides. Terry is the senior managing principal at Sovereign Trends, an advisor to central banks and foreign governments. He's also a contributing editor here at Bloomberg, and he's been talking to both Republicans and Democrats down on Capitol Hill. So, Terry, let us talk about the business of compromise. There's a new political reality, right? Since the last election, the Republicans are in control of the House. So at the end of the day, an agreement has to be reached. How do you bridge the divide between what you might call the old fogies or the longtime political operatives, this gang of six behind closed doors, negotiating away in Washington, trying to come up with an agreement of their own, and the 78 freshman Republican who believe that it is their duty to fulfill an obligation that they came to Washington with?
Yeah. Well, so I think what's going to happen, Eric, is, and politicos are going to study two recent votes. The last continuing resolution vote, which we just had, where 1/4 of the Republicans abandoned their party, went over to the other side and joined Nancy Pelosi. So the Ron Pauls and Michelle Bachmans and Mike Pence's, the continuing resolution had the wrong consonant. It cut billions. They want to cut trillions. So I think people look at the continuing resolution vote where the Blue Dog Democrats and a lot of centrist Republicans that Steny Hoyer really controls joined with John Boehner's crowd and got the continuing resolution through. I think if the Gang of Six has any chance at all, you're right. We're looking at some kind of a bipartisan coalition like that.
Let's talk about what I might term, and you might term, the recipe for a responsible compromise. And let's start with shrinking the deficit. Larry Fink was here yesterday, the CEO of BlackRock, and he said it needs to be at least $4 trillion, and it needs to be over 10 years. And on the 10 years point, he is drawing a distinction between what he thinks needs to happen and what the president thinks needs to happen.
That's right. And I think that, Larry's grabbed a number, and obviously the Democrats and Republicans, this $4 trillion number over 10 years, not 12, 4.5, is one of the sine qua nons for a deal. Okay, so that's one of them. There are other, though, I think, key pillars to getting the centrist crowd together.
Right, the mix of spending cuts and tax increases, call it.
And this is where you and I had a little bit of a fist fight last week, and you were saying taxes, and I was saying no spending. Can I give you a number? Can I give you just one number?
I want to be clear. I'm being the devil's advocate here more than anything else.
Good for you. Let's keep devils out of it, too. The magic number for everyone to keep in mind, and in my conversations with Blue Dog Democrats, the crowd headed by Heath Schuler, this is really the magic number: 20% of GDP. Everybody throws around numbers, but if we can spending, if we can keep federal spending within spitting distance of 20% of GDP, no good Republican of conscience and no good Democrat of conscience could really not vote for that type of a plan.
Well, how does that compare to what we have now?
Well, the deficit is 10% of GDP because we're only raising 15% of revenue and spending 25%. So that's why it looks.
That's where you get to $1.6 trillion of deficit.
That's where you get to the big numbers. 10% of GDP is what we are now. We're borrowing 40 cents of every dollar every day. So what's important to understand, though, is that gets much worse in the out years. Spending as a percent of GDP in 2080 is 80% of GDP, which is the point I made on air last week. That's why we're talking 4-to-1 spending cuts, because the out years are so important. And that's why, Eric, you say taxes are intractable for so many Republicans, and frankly, for the thoughtful Democrats. They know health care is the driver of the debt.
But it doesn't sound like in your mind taxes are necessarily that intractable, because the compromise is somewhere in the middle. The president says a 3-to-1 mix of spending cuts versus tax increases. So far, the Republicans have said no tax increases, but you think there is that opportunity for a compromise?
Let's be careful with what the president says, because he hasn't said too much. Let's actually stick with Simpson Bowles, Domenici Rivlin. There's a number of plans out there. Alan Blinder talked about them in the Wall Street Journal yesterday. Almost all the plans that address the revenue side with anything other than soak the rich are a broaden the base, lower the rates plan. Broaden the base, get rid of those deductions, get rid of those tax expenditures.
And that's an important point, because Tim Geithner said yesterday there is no, I'm going to quote him, there is no way to do this without changing the tax code.
We all know. We all know what we have to do. Are we going to do it, Eric? Are we going to do what we all know we have to do?
Well, that is the question.
No.
Listen, I don't need to tell you this. so much is invested in trading tax breaks for votes, are even the Republicans who have been wedded to that system for so long prepared to give it up?
This is, again, another mischaracterization of the Ryan Plan. The Ryan Plan requires that all of those be given up.
I know that. No, I'm not talking about Paul
revenues
Ryan.
under the Ryan Plan go to 19% of GDP, by the way, 19% of GDP. So the idea that somehow pro-growth tax reform does not generate more revenues for the federal government needs to be disavowed.
I wasn't suggesting that for a moment. All I'm saying is that outside of the 78, no, I'm not. Outside of the 78 here, everybody else in Congress has been living with this system for so long. Can you really, can Paul Ryan really sell the idea of tax reform to the Republican constituency at large?
So Tom Coburn, who's one of the members of Gang of Six, said everybody's going to hate what we're going to come out with. Everyone's going to hate it. Everyone's going to pick at it. And that's why I've been saying, and why S&P agreed with you and I, or me afterwards, saying this is a really tough vote, Erik. To get the Gang of Six plan through, certainly it doesn't get done before the debt ceiling needs to be raised, but to get it through without a moment of crisis, without the type of crisis we had for the TARP vote, it's just really unlikely that we get it done.
So, Terry, talking about tax reform, I mean, who is Geithner really speaking for? The president, Pelosi, himself? I mean, what was that soundbite about?
I think it's clear that Secretary Geithner is doing the right thing by dialing down the rhetoric, Deirdre, from the president's speech and just looking for open ground. He knows, John Boehner knows, we're going to pass this debt ceiling resolution. The question is it going to be a political embarrassment for the Republicans when they do because nothing meaningful is attached to it? Or are they going to be able to attach something? And I think what you're hearing from Secretary Geithner is, let's make this a meaningful vote. Let's all find the common ground that we all know we need to have the breakthrough.
Where is the common ground going to be hardest to reach? We know that the president, for example, said that there need to be binding cuts if targets are missed. So there seems to be common ground there.
Right. Debt feels safe.
Right. So and Tim Geithner just said yesterday that there needs to be tax reform. So there is some common ground there. Yeah. Where is it going to be hardest?
You know, Erik, I think the real lines in the sand are on anything that has to do with taxes that is not going to be wrapped in pro-growth tax reform. Again, with the broadening the base, lowering the rates, that's going to be a tough sell. So you're going to have to talk about raising revenues, not through raising rates, but through reform of the code.
Eliminating loopholes,
and I guess
effectively.
Making everybody just pay 25% is not an option.
Well, you know, in all the plans, you're talking about eliminating those deductions, Deirdre, right? So out goes mortgage interest, out goes charitable deductions, no longer writing a check to your alma mater.
These are sacred cows.
So tough, such a tough vote to take. The other intractable one, though, Erik, and it's important to understand why it's so intractable, is health care. So the administration spent the first half of its life on Obamacare. That's going to have to be revisited.
Terry, thanks so much for joining us. As always, our contributing editor.